right, this should do it. Yay! So yeah, I'm Bob de Schutter. So I'm originally from Belgium. I work at Miami University of Ohio now. I'm a professor there. And well, as you can see in this talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to design meaningful games for an older audience. Ian actually asked me to do a condensed version of my GDC talk from last year. Could you raise your hand if you were there by any chance last year? Okay, so it's a minority. Okay, thanks for coming last year, guys. Really appreciate it. So yeah, last year's talk was about 60 minutes, so I'm going to do a 20-minute one right now. I thought we're going to do questions afterwards, so we'll see how it goes. I do have some new stuff at the end of it, so if you've seen it last year, there's still some new stuff coming up. So my opening question here is, well, why is it important to think about older adults when you're making games in general? And well, the first reason for that would be, here we go, would be this. So I'm sure you might have seen these around. These are the annual statistics from the Entertainment Software Association. And it mentions that, well, we've gotten up to about 1/3 of the people, 27% of gamers in the United States being over 50. And that's a significant number. I mean, that's a lot of people. And actually, and the average age is about 35. And well, that actually has been confirmed by a whole bunch of different studies. I'm not going to go over each and every one of them, but if you look at it, you're looking at about 27 and 50% of people being over 50, of 50-plus-year-olds playing games, and 23 to 41% of 65-plus-year-olds playing games, depending on whether you're looking in Europe, the US, or Australia. The number is different. I haven't really found any numbers about Asia yet. If you happen to have those, please let me know, because I'd love to get my hands on those. But it's a substantial audience, and that audience is only going to grow as our society is rapidly aging. This is what our age pyramid looks like today, and this is what it will look like in 2050. Now, you can see how top-heavy that is becoming. Actually, by 2050, about 1/5, 20% of the world will be over 60, and that's twice the amount that it is today. So our population is aging rapidly. And if you take this data from the United Nations and you put it together with some of the data that I've shown you on the previous slide, let's say the one from the Pew Research Center, in case you're not familiar with them, they're a nonpartisan think tank, so they have reliable data. If we combine both of those, we see that right now we have about 26 million US gamers between 50 and 64, 11 million that are older than 65, and by 2045, and well, this is my bold prediction there, we will end up with anywhere between 46 and 105 million US gamers over 50. If you want some more detail on that, the presentation from last year goes in depth in that. It basically comes down to whether or not people that are 30, 40, 50 years old today keep playing or not, and that's where we get the spread between 46 and 105 million people. So if you think about the gamers of the future, well, these are the people that you should be thinking of. Now, of course, these are some fantasy demographics. We need to take a lot more into account, because that second scenario, those 105 million US gamers, well, that makes one big assumption. That assumes that 65-plus-year-olds will be physically capable of playing games, will be mentally capable of doing so, that they will find a way to fit games into their lives, and that they will still be interested in playing video games. So that brings me to the main question that I'm hoping to address in this session. How do we make this happen? As an industry, the question is, how can we earn 105 million US gamers? This is not just going to happen overnight, obviously. And the answer to that question is fairly straightforward, I'd argue. It basically comes down to accessibility, which is why I'm here. And it comes down to providing great content as well. Now, I know that I'm probably preaching to the choir here, but here's why I feel that accessibility should matter to any game designer out there. And this really helps me to connect this topic to my students at Miami. Because it doesn't really matter what shape you might be in today. At some point in your life, you will face some form of an age-related disability. Something that might prevent you from using a gamepad, from hearing audio cues, from keeping track of what's going on screen. You might even struggle turning on a console without a caregiver. So there's really no way around it, and it affects all of us eventually. So here's a list of recommendations that I typically talk about in my design classes. I've just condensed everything on one slide because I know there's a lot of accessibility experts in this audience today. And well, some of these things are pretty straightforward. Some of these things have even been mentioned already, like using higher contrast has been discussed about. We looked a lot about customizing audio, but also things like slowing down the pace is something that you would probably think of when you think of having older adults play with lower reaction speeds. Others are obviously not that straightforward. For example, avoid high frequencies because your hearing goes down in those frequencies as you age, or adjust the amounts of minutes that are adjust the amount of words that are said per minute in the dialogue of your game. Now, most importantly, I believe that none of these implementations really cost a fortune to implement, and I don't think they necessarily should conflict with your game design. So when it comes down to accessibility, I really have three big recommendations. First one being, every little bit helps. That slide had a whole lot of different things on it, but you don't necessarily have to implement each and every one of it. If you just implement some adjustments to help people who are colorblind play your game, you've already addressed an issue for a huge amount of people. So every little bit helps, and I think that's particularly important for indie game developers. I mean, I'm working on an indie game myself right now, and I'm just trying to do the best that I can within the limited resources that I have available to myself. Second, I think it's important to consider accessibility from the very beginning of the design process. So if you're looking at the list that we were talking about earlier, just see what, from the very beginning, from your core mechanics, think what are we going to implement here, which makes it a lot easier than when you have to do it at the very end of your game design process and you have to tear things apart again and put it back together in different ways so that it's more accessible and people can actually play your game. And then finally, and this is the big one that comes from my own research with older adults, and I think it kind of ties into what Bryce was talking about just earlier. It's all about adjusting the interface, but never adjusting the challenge. And I've got a nice anecdote about that, because, well, older adults, they do want to be challenged in a game, and I've often noticed that by observing them. So I will never forget how this 70-year-old man just destroyed me at Trackmania. So this is footage from Trackmania, in case you're not familiar with that game. This is a really difficult stunt driving game. I mean, this gets hard. And it's all about reaction speed. It's all about spatial awareness. It's not designed for older adults as far as I'm aware. I mean, I don't know the designers, but I don't see anything that hints me in that way. But, it didn't stop this guy. He played it day after day. It was his favorite game he ever played, he told me, and he just kept practicing until he just completely beat every level on the highest settings. There we go. Yeah, so always keep that in mind when you're designing for older adults. I always tell my students, think about the Trackmania guy. Accessibility should never interfere with a proper challenge. If the interface is adjusted in the ways that, well, I've shown you on the slide or that we've been talking about today, older adults will persevere and they will master your game. So here's another challenge, another example. I'm sure there has been a lot of press on Wii bowling in retirement communities and older adults picking up that game. And well, there's also a lot of research, and the research studies typically have the exact same story over and over. It always starts with older adults having problems playing the game because it's not optimized that well for them. It's a very new motion control type of thing that they're not used to either, but they keep practicing. Eventually they get a hang of it, they get good at it, and then all the benefits of it come out. You see social interactions go up in the group, there's better physical health, there's increased self-esteem, and so forth. There's plenty of studies like this and examples of how this can work. So those are the things that I have to discuss about for the older audience directly in terms of accessibility. Let's move on to the second point, which brings me to content, because we have a little bit of work to do there as well. And I'm going to start with a very dramatic quote. So older adults are less motivated to play games, and we see that in a whole bunch of studies. It's not just my research. My fellow academics have found this as well, and even Nikki with Quantic Foundry, who does market research, They had a sample of more than 100,000 people, and they found this as well. In general, if we look at motivation levels for older adults, they go down. So why would that be? Well, in quantitative research, it can often be a black box, but if you look at qualitative research, it gets clear pretty fast. And I'm not going to refer to my own research here, but I'm going to refer to that of Celia Pierce to, just keep a little bit of distance so it's not just all my stuff. But in general, we see that older adults tend to feel left out. As the quote said, they feel that there's a lack of attention by the mainstream industry to their interests. They feel that games are formulaic, derivative, too much emphasis on graphics and not enough on innovation. And well, that's not my opinion, but it's also what a lot of older adults have told me when I ask them what kind of games that they're playing and what they would like to play in the future that might not be available to them yet. And that brings me to why the talk is called Beyond Ageism, I guess. Because if you think about games for older adults, well, typically people think about brain trainer games and Exergames or embodied fitness games. And in my opinion, that's problematic. First of all, it's problematic because of this. Stanford Center on Longevity has published this consensus of the scientific community on brain training games. And we actually don't have any compelling evidence that these games are efficient, that they work, that they do what they're promising to do. And this consensus has been signed by a lot of respected names in the field, many of which would benefit directly if this effect would actually be there because they would make a lot of consultancy money. Of course, brain training games have been very successful at some point at selling copies, but then again, you're selling copies based on the premise of fear, of getting older, and well, if you're scared of something, you will buy anything to avoid that, obviously. In my own research, I talked to a lot of older adults about playing brain games and how they felt about brain games and Exergames, and typically they say, well, I didn't like it. I never really felt like it helped me. Sure, I saw my scores go up, but it's kind of trivial, and the games themselves were never really that fun. I remember a lady telling me that, she just brought back brain games to the store and then just, bought a new Zelda or something because at least that was fun to play. So anyway, regardless of the effectiveness though, I would also argue that brain games and health games in their marketing have been pushing some pretty messed up messages. Because the message that you're putting out there is that, well, these games are for older adults, but they're all about bettering yourself and in particular about being young again. Because after all, if you're not young, you're not very useful to our society anymore and so on. So that's pretty messed up. I mean, think about it. How would you feel if every game that's made for you stereotypes you and pushes forward artificial ideals? How awful would that be? Well, I guess every female player in the audience kind of knows how that feels. So yeah, I've gone on record saying, well, brain games are sexist, brain games are ageist. Let's see here. So yeah, health games for older adults that are only about external outcomes fall in a similar category. So what I try to do in my work is how can we move past this and how can we look at aging and games from a positive angle. And well, it's a condensed version, so I'm going to get to the point right away. It basically comes down to doing this here. Make games that incorporate these four elements: innovative gameplay, thought-provoking themes, meaningful dialogues, and aesthetic experiences. And this comes from talking to a lot of older adults about what they want from games, what they feel that is missing. And honestly, I'm not too surprised. That sounds like games that even if you're a 30-plus-year-old or a 40-plus-year-old, I'm sure there are 16-year-olds that are looking for games that do this type of stuff as well. So on average, you'll find that older adults want soft and smart content over fast and aggressive content. And we've also seen it in general media preferences such as television and movie preferences. Now, I've got 3 comments with that though. First, a design tip. Innovation and meaningfulness, well, those things are subjective, obviously. And what might seem really dumb or a really dumb casual game or something as an experienced gamer can be extremely innovative and can be very clever to an older adult that's not as familiar with games. So all these things are very subjective. Second, this is, well, an average. Like Bryce was saying, the average doesn't really define your audience entirely. So, I've talked to a lot of older adults who love violent games, who love games with, sexual content in it as well. It's just that in general, these things are more prevalent than what older adults seem to be looking for. And finally, I'm not saying that this is something that we as an industry are not doing already. I mean, obviously there's a lot of games that do this really, really well. I would just argue that, well, for older adults, it's something that they need help with finding. And in particular, I think, let's see, is this thing on? All right. I'm just going to go manual here, I guess. All right. In particular, I think indie games do a really, really good job at this. And I've tried these things out with older adults. For example, we tried Papers, Please, and it went really well. And why wouldn't it? Papers, Please is a great puzzle game. It's embedded in a social realist novel. It has innovative gameplay, meaningful dialogue. It's thought-provoking, beautiful pixel art. And I think that's a key point, really. It's often also about curating and marketing indie games towards older adults in a different way. So I think this is a really great fit, and I think for indie developers, this is an audience you really want to be looking at, especially considering how many indie games come out this year and how many of them have big problems to actually find an audience. So with this, I've reached the point where I'm going to go away from my GDC talk from last year a little bit and into something different, because I've actually been doing this over the past year. I've had this club, which we call the Oxford Adult Gamers Club. It's not the Oxford Aging Gamers or something. We specifically called it the Adult Gamers Club. But all our members are retired. Well, I have one that's not retired, but most of them are retired. We are about 20 people. Sometimes we have some people coming in who are not recurring, so we get it up to 30. And in this club, I introduce games to older adults, and it's very informally. So I thought, well, considering that I've done this talk last year and there was going to be some people who have already seen it, I thought I'm going to talk a little bit about the games that we tried and how it worked out. And I just want to highlight 10 games, 5 of which I've already played with the club and 5 that I'm planning to play with them. So let's say the top 10 of games for older adults in terms of content, and we can talk about accessibility in there a little bit as well. So the game that I had the best success with the club so far is so different from anything that I ever thought was going to be the most popular game amongst them. It's Diablo 3. And Diablo 3, I mean, it's a game in which you traverse hostile fantasy worlds, you gather loot, you make your character as strong as possible. It's a role-playing game that you can play with a party of 4. But to this audience, I tried World of Warcraft with them as well, and they didn't like it at all. It's just too nitpicky, too hardcore, if you will, whatever term you want to give to it. But Diablo is more casual, and it actually helped them to play a game like this. They actually absolutely loved them. And one of the reasons I loved it, and one of the reasons for that is, the party of 4 was very strong for them. They could play this in a social setting. And they went through these quests all together. In terms of accessibility, we didn't have too many problems except, 2 things. I mean, the first one is a cultural one. For them, it was really hard to, a dungeon dweller, if you're a gamer, you know this type of stuff, but a lot of my older adults come in with different backgrounds and have never really played games like this. So getting to learn what this game is all about was hard for them in the beginning, and we needed to get across a couple of cultural barriers, and this is how these things typically work, games like this. The second one is, for some of our older adults, the interface can be pretty small. We have like 24-inch iMac setup, and the font sizes just get really small in Diablo. Aside from that, not too many issues in terms of accessibility. I can kind of get into that at this point as well, I guess. The one thing with the Oxford Adult Gamers Club, obviously, is, it has been hard, from my perspective, to recruit people who, aren't healthy still. I was kind of hoping that we, would have some people who had significant things going on in order to play games. But everybody that we get is just in prime health still. And I think it has something to do with just, for them to come out and actually play games in this LAN setting, there's kind of a barrier. So in terms of accessibility recommendations, most of the time we don't have significant issues, except things like audio being hard to hear because a lot of people are talking at the same time, which can also, we're in a LAN setting. Then the other one being font sizes being too small in certain games. However, the next game that we've got, Plants vs. Zombies, worked really well. You know, it's a casual game. It's very appealing to a broad audience. What clicked really well here is we have some older adults that got into first-person shooters and really like to play those in their spare time. Overwatch was really popular with them, for example. And then we have an audience that just plays cell phone games on, well, mobile games. And, well, Plants vs. Zombies really clicked for both audiences. So that was really interesting. I actually got my mom addicted to it. So I feel pretty good about that because she never played games. And well, from neuroscience, I've read a couple of times that doing things that you typically don't do in your life are a really good way to actually keep your brain fit as opposed to the brain training games. So, you know, getting people to play games that have them do things and think about things in a different way than that they're used to is actually a really good thing. Then we've got Minecraft. Well, for Minecraft, I brought it in first and it didn't go well at all. It was hard. It was really hard to get them to play this. And then we decided we're just going to organize 5 series workshops and we're actually going to have you learn to play this game. In terms of accessibility, we made some adjustments so things were easier to see on screen. And the biggest one, which isn't an accessibility thing, but the biggest adjustment that we made was we never let it turn into the night until the participants were actually ready to go in the night. Because if you know Minecraft, at night the monsters come out and they'll kill you if you're not prepared. And that's where I went wrong the first time because it was very demotivating. I mean, it gets night really fast and just everybody in the group just dies right away. And it's like, wow, this game's really hard. And Bob, you said this was a creative game in which we're going to build stuff and we got killed in 5 minutes. And you know, like I was saying, a lot of older adults aren't really into violence and action all that much, so that was really disappointing. But in the workshop, it went really well, and what was very powerful about the Minecraft experience for me personally was we saw a lot of great positive effects come out. And I'm not an effects researcher, but it's really powerful when you just see this happen. I'm sure you're all aware that Minecraft is about creativity, about collaborative play, and all those types of things, so obviously we see older adults engage in those things. But the 3D navigation was extremely interesting to see. To give you an example, I had this 80-year-old lady who had very little computer experience getting into Minecraft for the very first time. And she's playing this game and she's standing there and her screen is just completely red. And I immediately see what's going on. I mean, she's standing like this against a bunch of bricks. Well, like this so you can hear me in the microphone. But you know, she's completely with her face standing against the wall. And she's like, I think the computer broke, Bob. And I'm like, well, no, you're fine. You're just standing straight against the wall. Like, you know, in real life, you stand to a wall like this, you don't see anything. Oh, yeah. So what do I do? Because, you know, she's still really learning mouse movement and keyboard movement. So I'm like, well, all you got to do is turn the mouse around and it'll be fine. Well, obviously, that was overly simplified from me because she just, well, let's say this is my mouse. She just grabs the mouse, she turns it around, puts it back down, and so nothing happened, Bob. I think it's still broken. I'm like, oh no, you have to turn the mouse around. But you know, that's kind of the cultural differences that we typically have issues with and that we have to overcome. And but at the same time, you know, that 80-year-old lady in those 5 sessions, she went from standing against a wall, not even knowing what's going on and having a really hard time navigating, towards being able to survive the night in Minecraft, to slay zombies at night and walk around. And it's just 5 1-hour sessions. There's a research article by Feng and Spence who write about, you know, 5 to 8 hours to overcome these navigational difficulties, and well, it's really cool when you can see it in real life. Finally, what was really cool about Minecraft as well, in my opinion, was the crafting system. It was a really fun memory game for a lot of our participants. In the beginning, I was like, well, we can just print these out if you want. And we're like, no, we want to memorize them because then it's a brain game. I'm like, yeah, I mean, why not? Let's do it that way. And obviously, since you need it a lot in the gameplay, eventually it gets embedded in your system. But yeah, it worked out really well, and I could see, you know, doing an exploration sandbox game, having a lot of positive, you know, uses or applications for older adults that way. And yeah, that experiment really showed this. And I've had a couple of older adults talk to me about this, is that they play it with grandchildren, they play it with family members, because it's very easy to play with 2 people. You know, you can both try to tackle the problems, and it's kind of like you're playing this interactive movie and your grandkid is doing the controls. And I think that's something that a lot of games could learn from for an older audience, and I think the Copilot mode that Bryce was talking about earlier is actually an awesome thing for that. I think more games should do that. The one thing that always comes to mind for me is I think Mario Sunshine. There's something where one player could have a Wiimote and pick up all the power-ups and all the coins while the other player is actually playing Mario Sunshine. So things like that are really great for older audiences. And well, classic adventure games, actually, a lot of people play them in that way. So moving on, I've got a couple that we're going to try out this year. We're going to do a whole bunch of iPad board games, because they're also the pass and play. I think a lot of the things that I'm looking into right now is, like I was just saying, the intergenerational play and things that bring the social aspects of games in collocated setting to life. I also think, a lot of, especially Euro games, have a lot of tactical and creative thinking, which could relate to health benefits. Oh well, this was not supposed to be in this version anymore because I already talked about Papers, Please. I want to try Her Story. My parents currently have gotten into this and are really hooked to it, because a lot of older adults have talked to me about, well, what's the best detective game that's out there? And I always had to tell them, like, well, play something like Beyond Two Souls or Heavy Rain. Those were the games that typically came to mind, or maybe a classic adventure game like a Gabriel Knight or something. But for my parents who are really not gamers, that's not really what they're looking for, and Her Story seems to get on that niche of what they're actually looking for, because it's more video oriented, and it really gives you the sense that you're a detective trying to solve this. So next up, we're going to try Elegy of a Dead World. A lot of my female participants in the Oxford Older Gamers Club have talked about, well, what I like about Minecraft is the sense of being creative, but the building blocks things is not really clicking for me. Don't you have anything else? And especially something that would be more about writing skills. And well, then I saw Elegy for a Dead World, and it's like, well, for people who don't know, this game is a game in which you see these images like the one on screen, and you write poetry while you're playing it. So that's the mechanic of it. It's basically words on paper. So I think this is a really good match for this audience. And then in terms of Exergaming, well, Bounden has been in the experimental gameplay workshop, I think two years ago. It's a game in which you play with two people, and you look at your smartphone and it gives you instructions on how to move your bodies, and you get into this experimental dance together. And there are a lot of concerns that I have here with how are we going to be able to do this with motions, because with older adults, you have to keep in mind they can't all kneel, they can't all bend in ways that younger people can. So I'm really looking forward to see how this is going to work, if it works at all. But it's something that I'm curious about, because obviously for social connection and a whole bunch of things that older adults are looking for in games, it checks off a lot of boxes. So this is something in which I'm really interested in, the accessibility of it, but so far we haven't looked into it yet. And then finally, Bounden. So like bound, like wrapping something with a cord, and then EN behind it. Well, the last slide's not on here because this is the older version. Then there's obviously VR. Because, I'm not sure if you noticed it, but I'm getting further and further away from just sitting down with a controller. For VR games, I've done a whole lot of tests the last year. We've played a whole bunch of games. And actually on Thursday at 3:30 and 3020 West Hall, I will be talking about that topic. I'm updating the presentation I did last year entirely for VR. And we noticed a lot of interesting things on getting older adults to play VR, but obviously I'm just going to keep all of that for Thursday, and hopefully I'll get some people in there. And yeah, that's going to be it for me. Thanks so much, and well, I don't know if we've got time for questions. Yeah, I know, and it was a 20-minute talk, so.